Hello everyone, my name is Jane Einstein, that's Jane with an E and Einstein with an I after each E, and I am the body language gal. Now I decided to make this channel after noticing an abundance of body language channels that I felt were a little bit biased and a little bit dishonest. And I thought it would be good to sort of, if someone could come in and assess the body language people themselves, because sometimes I think a lot of these body language experts are, well, one, not experts, and two, knowingly dishonest. And I think for some people, they need to have that spelled out a little bit well, clearly, because I think for some people it actually isn't clear, even though it might be obvious to a lot of other people, even people who agree with these body language experts. I think even for them it's obvious that some of these body language experts aren't necessarily being honest, but are more feeding a fan base of people with certain prejudices and biases. But I think every so often, an honest, earnest, true bumpkin gets lost in the mix and might actually take a lot of these body language experts' words at face value. So I want to be here for that. I want to be here to correct the misinformation and the false or erroneous assessments. That's my job. So the video that I am assessing today is like a triple analysis, because I'm going to be assessing Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the guy, the body language guy. His name is escaping me at the moment, but it's okay. Right now it's not important. So why don't we get started?
Well, hello and welcome back, my body language buddies. We hadn't seen the Markle Claw in a while, and this is our opportunity to watch not one, but a double Markle Claw at the most recent appearance of the Harkles at the United Nations when Harry was giving his speech.
So right off the bat I have to interject to point out that body language guy is making it pretty clear that he has a bias of disliking this couple by calling them a name that is not, it's not a name of affection, it's not a name of warmth, he calls them the Harkles. That's a name of derision, and he's meaning to be insulting, which, I mean, I guess this is not, it's not like he's their therapist, so I guess he doesn't have to maintain some sort of veneer of professionalism, but it is revealing of a bias, and the problem with that is when you have the bias of disliking someone, you are almost certainly going to be less charitable in how you perceive their movements, their motions, and this is, well, I mean, worst case scenario, this is potentially dangerous because you can misinterpret someone and, in doing so hurt them because of your misinterpretation, and I guess that could actually be hurting them physically in a real life setting. It could also be hurting them mentally and emotionally. In this case, I suppose it could be the latter, because, if they watch this, I suppose. But yes, it's not a good idea to try to assess someone when you have such a negative bias towards them. It hinders your ability to be objective. That's not always the case, but in the case of the body language guy, that is the case. He has quite a history of uh, negative feelings towards this particular couple. So at least from the titles I gather, he doesn't really ever give them a fair shake, a fair assessment, or at least that's how it seems, which is the problem with bias and then putting yourself in this position of being an analyzer of people you don't like. But moving forward.
Well, they were sitting, this is before he given the speech, they were sitting together. Harry was quite relaxed, and you can see his hands on his legs. And, well, Meghan said maybe Harry is smiling too much. Let's correct that, because you can see that Harry was, well, smiling at that moment, with genuine smile. I think it's a genuine smile. But then...
So this is an example of how subconscious or conscious prejudices and irrational biases can impact how we view people of certain identities, how we view women. So, like the comment he made, it's a nasty comment, it's an unkind and uncharitable comment where he's created a narrative for Meghan Markle that she feels he's smiling too much. And I mean, that's the kind of thing that's dangerous potentially, because it's truly baseless. It's truly, that is the sort of thing that is rooted in biases, prejudices against a number of identities. It could be against women of color specifically. It could be just a general hostility for, I don't know, non-blood royals or something. But it's not rooted in a fact. Like, if you look at them in that moment, they're just a couple who did a very normal thing that couples do, that humans in all iterations of relationships do, just to people, even strangers. When you share funny words, a funny observation, whatever, you smile at each other, you laugh about it, and then slowly your smile subsides. That's the nature of our species. We don't walk around just like 24/7 smile plastered to our face, right? So it's just this was just from just looking at it, if we're being objective, it's a benign interaction between, in this case, a husband and a wife, where one said something to the other to make each other laugh, share a brief laugh. But this assessor, the body language guy, he doesn't like them. So he's created this narrative where she's this sort of a stereotype. These are the things that are dangerous, because it's rooted in the stereotype about women and how they're like, controlling. It's ancient, that stereotype. And here it is in this man who's supposed to be doing this assessment to an audience, and it's not a clean assessment. It's one that's biased, and not just biased, but biased with irrational ideas and prejudices that are potentially dangerous, because all we see is two people sharing a laugh. So putting more on that, less on that, even walking away saying they're in the most happy relationship ever is too much. You don't know any of that. You can't know any of that from a brief interaction. But let's move on.
But then Meghan goes and grabs his hand, and you can confirm that Harry was still smiling at that moment, okay? And Meghan does it casually, okay, in even looking away. She was looking at him and then looks away. When the moment she touches his hand, what happens with his expression? Let's see it in slow motion. It changes completely, looking to the other way, like hiding his expression from Meghan.
Well, what we saw with our actual eyes is the natural thing that happens that I just described when two humans share something funny. There's laughter and smiling, and then there is the natural easing back into one's countenance, your like resting face. So for Harry, I mean, I've noticed he goes back in it sooner, and he's still there's. I mean, from what I'm seeing, I still see the tiniest remnants of smile. And Meghan, who seems always kind of poised, is still smiling. Could be because she's so like media trained, poised, and maybe even just still amused. That also naturally happens. They vary in how long they find whatever thing was said amusing. So it could be that. Those are the benign, um, realistic, charitable reasons. And Harry is just like done, and they both look away from each other, her in one direction, him in another. But, if you don't like them, or more, I guess if you don't like, I mean, your perspective seems to be you don't like her, and you see him as a victim of her. Another ancient, dangerous stereotype of a heterosexual relationship dynamic where the man is this victim of the woman, which is just kind of perplexing in a world that is so, in most countries anyway, it's very male dominated, but there's still persists this ancient idea of women having just this insane power, like mythical, magical levels of power over men. Um, and again, it's ancient, that one. But as far as interactions, it's pretty normal for people, and then the specifics are pretty normal for these two. And it's an active choice you're making to frame it as something negative and her as sinister and him as victimized. It's so baseless, and it's so potentially hurtful to, well, I think in the broader sense, because you have a pretty large audience to women, and to this couple specifically. So, like, looking away, that's not necessarily hiding your face. That, again, is an uncharitable assessment of someone who you've already decided is being victimized by his wife. So, your lens is not exactly clean and clear of Harry's movements and behaviors here. But moving forward.
You can that's you cannot unsee that. She grabs his hand in a controlling gesture.
So this is where prejudice can lead a person, because that was a very maligning statement, and it isn't true. Like, what we see is Meghan holds Harry's hand in an overhand position, and holding someone's hand in that at that angle, because it's just the most accessible angle to hold your partner's hand, is not one, it's not a controlling move. It's what is the control? Like, a controlling gesture would be if Harry were like raising his hand and she grabbed his hand and pulled it down. That's a controlling gesture. But just putting her hand on his as it was sitting there, there's no control in that. There's a controlling type of hand holding that romantic couples can do to each other, and that's more like to signify to others that they are your partner, that you don't want them being flirted with. That's a more possessive, controlling type of hand holding. But this just sitting idly as they are and alternating between hand holding and not hand holding, there's no control in that. So this is what I would categorize as an erroneous analysis, and that's being a bit generous, because it does seem more malicious than erroneous. Erroneous implies like unintended error, but this guy clearly has a bias, and so he seems to be doing this maligning intentionally, um, particularly of Meghan. And so this is what I am trying to highlight, is a norm, a negative norm in the body language community of people with these prejudices, with these biases, these often misogynistic, often even subconsciously racist biases that people constantly have. You know, people constantly treat people differently based on race, based on gender, etc. And and it bleeds into how you interpret people naturally. And if you're an especially uh, unkind person, you can do that knowingly. You can do that deliberately and intentionally, and in a form. It's in itself. It's a form of manipulation. When you use words like this, you are leading your audience to see things in this negative way intentionally. When you tell them it's controlling, but this is your biased assessment. This is an accusation, really, that is baseless. And again, it can be dangerous, because the more you malign someone, the more this is a common, like, war tactic. It's a common political tactic where you malign, so you can sort of dehumanize the person, and then that justifies to many treating them in an inhumane way, which has really kind of become the norm with Meghan Markle specifically, but also, you know, Harry as well, to a lesser extent. This is what I'm trying to combat and shed a light on, because fundamentally it's just a very wrong and pretty cruel thing to do. But let's move forward.
You can see that her hand is absolutely covering him.
It really isn't, though. As someone who's had her hand enveloped by a man with large, what I used to call baseball glove-sized hands, I know what a enveloped hand looks like that's completely covered. That is not it. Meghan's hand is like gently laying like over and within his, and you can still see his hand. So, I don't know what's meant by covered, but it seems again like an attempt to manipulate the audience and reframe something normal and benign as negative to, you know, inspire ire.
His hand, and he looks away, and he lets go of it. Let's go. He lets go his hand. Notice that. Notice what's going to happen going forward. He takes his hand away. Like, don't grab my hand. Do not do it. You saw that. We all saw that.
I mean, what we saw was Harry be done holding Meghan's hand and them breaking away and parting hands. That's an inevitability when you're holding hands. There's always the breakaway point eventually that someone initiates. So, you know, it could be a case of clammy hands, sweaty hands, just hot hands not in the mood. It's completely unknown to us what their philosophy and rules and beliefs are about holding hands. They could have a whole thing where, like, one of them's like, hold my hand when I seem nervous, or hold my hand when I seem scared, or hold my hand when I'm acting fidgety. You know, like, couples make up a million rules for themselves that are so private to their union, and, like, I don't know and you don't know, but you are acting like you do know, and you have created this, like, character in this moment, and it seems that this is your pattern, where Harry is, like, again, a victim of, you know, this witchy woman. And it's completely baseless, except for the basis of like those old uh, heterosexual misogynistic stereotypes where the woman is this like witchy woman and the man is her like poor little victim, and you've just imbued their relationship with this stereotype. You've just put it on them, and it's really unfair. And these decisions, this narrative, these accusations that you place on them, they fit this pattern of maligning the woman and victimizing the man, which is very harmful to women and girls, and is potentially harmful to this couple specifically, because it fuels very irrational and disproportionate hatred for them, but especially for her, especially for women. That's why I say it's a very cruel and misogynistic thing to do, and you seem to be doing it knowingly. Like, it's obviously very hurtful to this couple, and then also very harmful to push this illogical narrative and this ancient, baseless, misogynistic propaganda meant to manipulate and keep women distrusted, that says women are these creatures of control, so are more deserving of attack, and people you feel less empathetic towards when they are attacked, and who apparently have this borderline magical power to control the same sex that they've had to beg and plead to get basic human rights from in most of the world, which they've never really even had long term, not more than 100 years. And and how? By a mere touch of the arm, apparently? A holding of the hand? This controls men? It's kind of funny, but it's not funny.
And moving forward, she is not happy with Ed and then does the double Markle claw on his arm.
Well, claiming that she's not happy about that is you inventing a fiction based on your prejudice. It's like projection based on your own biases, not anything she said or did. What she did, what she actually did, I'm going to actually play it again without the commentary, because it can be a very manipulative thing when you're telling people what to see. It can be very dishonest, and in this context, it is. So I'm just going to play it without the commentary a couple of times. Okay, so I added a third time for good measure, and so you saw that, and what I saw was a woman go to rest her hand on her husband's arm, and then him react to that by moving his hand onto her lap, which seems to be a pretty comfortable thing for Harry. It's I've seen them do that before. I've seen him rest his hand on her lap before, and so that just seems like a personal thing for them as a couple, is they have a habit of doing this, and it's a choice, you know. Sometimes she's resting her hand on his arm and he just lets it rest there, and it looks like a form of affection, and just, you know, for couples who are affectionate, because everyone's different, every couple has their own unique dynamic for how much affection and physical touch they like, and what kind, and when, and where. And for these two, it seems like a pretty standard thing for them to express in this way in public. And so it seemed like more of that pattern. And it seemed a casual and even kind of subconscious thing for both of them. Because in this very video, she does that same gesture of resting her hand on his arm, and they just stay like that. And a body language guy will even call that normal in a few minutes. So it just seems like that is their normal, the touch, the type of touch. But body language guy says otherwise. And I'm just going to replay his take on this one more time.
And moving forward, she is not happy with it and then does the double Markle claw on his arm.
So another assessment that is mired by that misogynistic prejudice where he invents words for her and feelings for her that are rooted in that misogynistic archetype of the clingy, conniving, meanie pants woman that he's just decided is Meghan Markle without knowing her, even though it contradicts quite a bit of her history. But his intention seems to be maligning her, and that is the standard go-to when you're trying to malign a woman. So that's what he seems to be doing, especially with language like the claw, the double claw, which is very derogatory. It's dehumanizing even, because obviously Meghan is without claws, as she is a human woman. Redundant, I know. But that kind of language is often employed to dehumanize. So when you're presented with something like a woman doing something benign and normal, like cradling her husband's arm when he voluntarily rests it on her lap, and this would ordinarily be viewed as something warm and affectionate and sweet even, but you need it to be a negative to make a point about her being a bad person, essentially. You would use negative language that would bring to mind negative imagery like claw, like clawing at, instead of like touching or cradling or allowing to rest in. These are all more accurate descriptions, but instead of using any of those, he frames this woman allowing her husband to rest his arm in her lap in this way that appears comfortable for both of them and appears normal for both of them. He reframes it as her clawing at him, because that sounds awful, right? Yeah, that's the intent, and it further frames her as someone bad, as something, emphasis on thing, sinister, something even not quite human, because humans don't claw, animals claw. Humans don't have claws. Meghan specifically, like, famously has actually very short nails. So it's very deliberately dehumanizing language, and it's presented in this way that is actually an example of something sinister, with a sort of like casualness and smile and wow, that's just crazy kind of vibe. But it's actually a very intentionally cruel and dangerous thing to do. Again, it's often a tactic employed to dehumanize and vilify those you don't like, because when you do that, it makes it easier to be cruel to them and to justify cruelty towards them, because you can't, be mean to someone who's done nothing wrong. Then you look like the monster, right? So this is a tactic employed by, if I'm just blunt, monstrous kind of people who are pretty cruel in their intentions and desires to work up hatred and ire and contempt, all irrational. Because none of this is an indicator of anything malicious on Meghan's part. So this is not a rational reason to hate her, to dislike her, but it will be used, partly helped with language like this, like the claw, she's clawing at him, as a reason to hate her and to justify hating her and treating her, again, inhumanely. That's what's happening here. And it happens a lot in body language videos.
Like, you're mine. Give me your arm because you're mine. You can. It's uncomfortable to watch that progression. Let's do it from the beginning again.
We see a woman allowing her husband to rest his arm in her lap. He moved it there voluntarily. He seems comfortable doing stuff like that. He's done it before. So this assessment that it's, or that she's thinking, you're mine, it's not definitive. It's not rooted in anything real. It's, again, this narrative that is rather misogynistic and from a person who is intentionally attempting to malign the woman half of this relationship. That should be apparent, but I don't think it is to everyone who watches these videos.
They're smiling. He is relaxed, hands on legs. Then Meghan touches his hand. He is not pleased because he looks away and his expression changes completely. He is not pleased because he looks away and his expression changes completely.
Well, we went over this earlier already, but it really doesn't change in some extreme way. It just seems to fall in that resting face that all faces do when they get over the humor of a joke or whatever made them laugh or smile. You know, humans don't stay smiling. They eventually fall into their resting face at various rates of time. You know, some people take longer to settle. Some people settle back to their resting face immediately. And also, it looks like Meghan's kind of looking around at people, so she might have simply made eye contact with people and maintained a smile for longer for that reason. You know, normal human reasons for their different rates of returning to resting face. These are all other reasons, but, you know, of course, if you have this bias where, you know, she's bad, he's victim, there can only be one reason for any of their movements, gestures. It has to be in support of that narrative that she is bad and he is victimized. Even though other interactions in this same clip contradict what he is saying, which we will soon see.
And he, like, give me my hand. Let's go for a hand. What's that? You can watch it again. Yeah, he takes his hand away. Okay, like, don't touch me, and she goes again for it, clingy.
Well, again, all she did was move her hand to rest it on his forearm, and then he responded by putting his whole forearm basically into her lap. That was his choice. She didn't pull it into her lap, actually, because she actually does the same move that you later call normal, where she rests her hand on his forearm in an affectionate, normal way that some couples who are into that kind of touch and PDA, they do routinely.
He begins to, you know, turn his ring, his wedding ring, twisting it. She begins to touch him. This is a bit more casual, a bit more normal.
And he didn't put his arm into her lap because, you know, they alternate. What I would gather from that is a more common sense assessment that, like any humans, they vary in what they want in the moment, what they feel like doing in the moment. So sometimes they're a little bit more affectionate, sometimes they're less. I don't think it's in this clip that you discussed, but in this, like, while sitting together at some point, like, he even, like, seems to unconsciously just sort of gropes, sort of caresses her leg, her whole leg, her leg, her knee and her thigh, and it just seems like that's their normal. That's how they interact with each other. That's what they're comfortable doing with each other, and it's so, well, it's very personal. It's a personal thing, the way you communicate through physical touch with your partner. It's a personal decision about how your dynamic works, you know, and it's so personal that it actually feels a bit inappropriate to make these assessment videos where you play and replay and replay and scrutinize their every move with each other. It's so, you know, abnormal. It's not something that most couples have done to them. Even famous ones, it's not something that most famous couples have done to them. It seems to usually be done to people whom the video maker has and feels some level of hostility towards. So it's really kind of like a new fashioned form of bullying a lot of the time. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time. You know, I get body language experts for, like, criminals, but it just feels intrusive. Although, to be fair, they are doing it in public, but it you know, it all feels so inappropriate still. But I'm doing this to sort of combat the very one-sided and very biased, hateful, you know, for lack of a softer word, hateful bias that seems to accompany body language channels, especially when they're assessing women. It's always there always seems to be that sort of misogynistic framing, and it all seems to sort of be intended to uphold that structure, that the male dominant power structure where, you know, distrust is sown in people's minds about women, as has always been the case, or almost always been the case, and men maintain that upper hand of, you know, actually the victims, despite despite history being quite the opposite. But it ultimately, that is what it does. It maintains that male power structure where men can kind of do no wrong and women can kind of do no right, especially if they're a targeted woman, especially if they're a woman of color, especially if that color is of black heritage, because there's a specific sort of anti-blackness that isn't necessarily experienced by other minorities who would fall under the of color umbrella. So, you know, these are all factors, these are all things that influence how people, one, genuinely perceive others, but it also influences people's desire to malign. I meant to get more into him, but I'm kind of preoccupied with breaking down his analysis. But his demeanor, his expression, it seems pretty obvious that he's, like, enjoying this, that there's a glee in what he's doing, and there's a knowing dishonesty about it. And he, like, there are parts where it doesn't seem like he even believes what he's saying, but it's like the kind of classic bully mindset. It's just fun to pick on people you don't like when you're a bully. It's very unfortunate. There's a lot of that type in the world, but there's a type of human that genuinely gets joy from being nasty to others, and especially seemingly innocent others. It's a very ancient thing, and it's especially followed women, and it's followed people of color, again, specifically black people. There's always been this, it's kind of next level. It's always so, like, if you read some of the things that like the way white people would treat black people, if you read about apartheid, if you read about certain, like I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but it's connected to, like, this being an established thing, in our species, broadly speaking, in our species, in one of the races of our species, certainly, that I'm sort of meaning to highlight here, white people, where they have this sort of, I don't know, not all of them obviously, but a lot of them get this joy in being very cruel, like beyond what you would even do to an animal. But like there's this game, the thing I was going to mention that I was kind of iffy about mentioning, but it was basically called N-word ball, but you know, they actually said the N-word. It was an American carnival game. I read about it a few years ago, and it's one of those things that blew my mind. And it's on par with things like with the way like death threats were screamed at like little Ruby Bridges as she was trying to go to school, that a school that was being desegregated so that black children could also attend. And it's just like you think about the mindset of someone who screams death threats at a little girl. It's not a normal mindset, and they like there's joy and there's like an irrational, obviously, level of rage there, and there's a glee in terrifying a child. That's like a very unique type of mindset, and it didn't just disappear because of the civil rights movement. I gotta tell you, people, the more innocent people who may watch this, that's not how that works. And the thing that's similar is something like N-word ball, because it was, you know, done at a time black people had so little. So it's this very special kind of thing of like getting joy from people who have so little, and like they have so little but you want to like humiliate them even more. And like that mindset, that ability to do that, it is connected to this. It is connected to what Body Language Guy is doing. It does come from the same kind of mindset, that glee and being cruel to others. It comes from the same mindset. It really does. And it never went anywhere. It did not go extinct because certain laws were passed. So this is how we live with it now, because it's not socially acceptable to be, you know, screaming death threats at little black children for the most part, and it's not socially acceptable to have a game like, oh, I didn't even explain what it was, gosh, N-word ball. To sum it up, this horrifying game is one where white carnival game creators made a game out of throwing balls at little black babies, and like you got extra points or you won something if you could make the baby spit up their mother's milk. I know, horrifying. And you think, who could think of something like that? Well, there's a certain type of human who has always existed, who you mustn't forget still exists, who gets joy out of tormenting people. And they can't do that. That is very illegal pretty much everywhere. So this is, I think, how they cope instead. You can't just call her these words. You can't, and they used to do versions of this to women too. That's like part of it. Misogyny is part of this, obviously. So, you know, Salem witch trials, anyone, tarring and feathering. There's always been this glee in humiliating women, you know, tearing, you know, ripping their hair out, literally covering them in tar and feathers. And then this glee in being cruel to black people of both sexes. And it's just, so when you're that combination of being female and having black heritage at the same time, it doesn't matter how much white heritage you also have, because I mean, this is obviously a very irrational mindset. And then this is what it leads to. These people need an outlet. They live and walk among us. And I believe that's what is the root of this most of the time. Not all of the time, but most of the time. That's what we're dealing with. So I know it might seem a long way from, but he's not saying it. I mean, you can't say that. You can't say things akin to, don't let little black girls go to school. You can't say things like, we should play a game of N-word ball. You can't do that anymore. So what, like, think about it. What do you do if you, like, imagine, try to imagine that people like that exist, if you can accept that people like that exist, so what do they do with their contempt for those groups that they still hate? What do they do when they come across women who they want to slander, when they come across black people, people of color whose of color is blackness, part blackness, when they want to harass them, hurt them, but they, in most ways they would have, 100 years ago, they can't because it's illegal. What do you do? What do you do instead? This is the one of the things you can get away with. And I do believe that's what's being done most of the time. So these little picking at and poking at and prodding at, nasty comments, creating this hate base, this is all they can do. So it's what they're going to do. But there are some, conspiracies about being paid to do it. But that, outside of that, like, you couldn't pay me to do it, so you would have to still be doing it of your own volition. But, all we can do is call it out and hope for a better pattern to emerge for the next generation of girls and women and people of color, and especially women and girls of color, and especially women and girls of color who have any level of black heritage, or African, I guess, heritage.
Again. And then he looks nervous. He begins with that nervousness. That moment when she grabs his arm.
He really doesn't look nervous. He just looks like he's staring off into the direction of the stage, like a few others around him are also doing. And again, she didn't grab his arm. He placed his arm in her lap, and she's holding on to it as, I mean, my God, the alternative would be he places his arm in her lap and she just puts her hands to the side and just lets it sit there floppy fish-like, which would be so unnatural. And this is the thing when you scrutinize people very, very closely with the intention of maligning their every move. It forces you to say things that are just not reasonable and have expectations for them that are not reasonable. A wife holding onto her husband's arm after he has placed it into her lap is a very normal response. I mean, my goodness, it's a normal response. She didn't do anything malicious or bad. But again, of course, if you are trying to malign her, frame her as a bad person and him as her victim, then of course every movement she makes is malicious and bad, even when it's not. This is not the type of person who is going to give, for the most part, an objective assessment of body language.
He begins doing that, grabbing the flap of his jacket. He begins, his knees begin to, jump again like he does when he's nervous.
So the thing that makes body language expertise be ruled as a junk science is stuff like this, where it's almost in the category of fortune teller, because he's doing this thing where he is sort of pretending to be a mind reader, where he's just decided that Harry's movements are owed to nervousness, and there's truly no way you can know something like that unless Harry has said that, told you that, or you are indeed a mind reader, which I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say you are not. So this is more of that projection of a narrative, the narrative being woman bad, man good, and helpless victim. Harry's gotta get free, and that's like, if that's your agenda, everything you say is going to be this biased, unreliable, dishonest, quote-unquote assessment that is meant to fit that agenda. So, Meghan's not going to get a fair shake here, and neither is Harry, actually.
His face is also tense at that moment.
It doesn't look tense, though. It looks more like a resting face, like the face you make when you're listening to something serious. And speaking of that, like most people's resting face, it kind of just looks bored or sometimes even sad. If you just, look at yourself when you're just fully rested, you're not trying to make any kind of expression, it looks like a kind of a sad face. And it's so easy to manipulate that if you're a public figure and just take that picture of you looking content and then project that they are miserable or they're sad. It's so easy. I see it done a lot, especially to Harry. And when someone is just content, not performing, not talking to a camera, just sitting at rest, their face, it almost always looks bored or sad. Go look. Some people do have a smiley, resting face. I know people like that, but most people don't. And so this is where, if this were like any other celebrity, if this were even most other women who are just not the target right now, well, this video wouldn't even be getting made, but also if people were sitting watching them, I don't know, at an award show or at a special sort of event at the UN for Mandela Day, and they just look like this, it's just like, oh, they're just watching what's going on the big screen or waiting for the next thing or whatever. But when you're in this mindset of not liking the person, the scrutiny is dialed way up. There comes with that prejudice of disliking a tendency to overanalyze and sort of sully normal, benign behaviors that people do and get away with every day, all the time, because they're just human movements, human expressions, human behaviors. But when you're trying to create a narrative for a person, in Harry's case, that he is a victim of Meghan, then you don't allow him his humanity. You don't allow him his agency of just being a person experiencing life and gesturing in the way that humans often and constantly do for a myriad of reasons that are not necessarily negative or are not necessarily tied to victimhood. Instead, you turn his every movement into evidence for what you've already decided is his character, essentially. So this is one of the flaws with body language analysis. It can just always kind of be used as a propaganda tool, and especially when it's being done in a spectator sport kind of way, it can be used to bully. It can be used as confirmation bias to target people who are already disliked, and of course people who are, marginalized groups will have a higher tendency to be targeted and to be unfavorably framed in these analyses. And it's the sort of thing where you get to hide behind pretending to be objective. And it's the sort of thing where you get to just play a character in a sense, and the character is like expert. You throw on a suit, it's overwhelmingly males who dominate in this, and they are overwhelmingly white, at least on YouTube, and it's like adjacent in mindset and philosophy, in intention, to the manosphere, to red pill spaces. It's a way to attack people, especially women, and to sort of uphold that patriarchal structure of women being put in their place. Like almost everything has an undercurrent of resistance against, feminism, and anything that even resembles a woman being too opinionated is considered a thing to deride in these types of videos very often. It's like an offshoot or a byproduct of those more directly misogynistic spaces, like those red pill spaces, the manosphere, etc., they're cousins. It is a way to think about it. They work under the same sort of principles and ideals and philosophies, which is essentially man good, woman bad. The man has to be bad in a very obvious way to ever get the bad label. And even then, the contempt is just never the same. The interest isn't even the same. The interest in seeing Prince Andrew criticized is not as intense, for example, as the interest in seeing Meghan Markle criticized and taken down a peg, and for a lot of these people humiliated, and, other terrible things, even much worse than that. And that feeling, that intense feeling of contempt for women, especially women who transgress in these sort of specific ways, usually in like left-leaning, feminist adjacent or flat out feministic ways, there's just nothing quite like the contempt people feel for that kind of woman versus even a murderous man. They're like, it's this weird, unfortunate thing where most people, at least in this space, Vladimir Putin, murderer, doesn't make them as angry and as yearning to see him humiliated and suffering and taunted as a Meghan Markle. And it's just, when you look at their quote-unquote crimes to compare them, they're just so disparate. It's insane. And you could even argue it is a type of insanity, a type of psychosis, this level of misogyny. But it's an ancient thing. It's an ancient thing that's pervaded our society since almost forever. And creators like Body Language Guy and most of the body language creators that I am aware of, they are of that same mindset. They tend to hate women more. They tend to be more critical of women. They definitely have that gender bias for men and against women. And you see it in everything they do. You see it in their patterns of content uploading. Anything that challenges even potentially that power structure, the racial power structure and the gender power structure of men on top, white on top, it gets maligned viciously by most of these types of people, most of these body language quote-unquote experts. That's the pattern. So I guess I'm really saying this for those who are not in the know, for those who are more, innocent, bumpkin-like. You have to be mindful of this. You have to understand where this is coming from and the bias in the way the person is reporting. I do think it's usually apparent, but there are people who are just slower to the take. So this is what that is for. This is who that is for. But I do suspect that at least like 60% of Body Language Guy's fan base are people who simply like that he hates Meghan Markle. They don't even necessarily believe what he's saying. They don't necessarily interpret her movements that way, like genuinely. I mean, they could. I'm not a mind reader, but it does seem more to be, because like I've engaged with a few of that kind of person. I don't know that they're his fans, but just in general. And there's a pattern of like, even when you present a fact, they tend to deny it or ignore it, or say, one of their go-tos is to say something like, well, that's just my opinion, even in the face of a contradictory fact. So I don't, these people, what they share is a prejudice, for the most part, against Meghan Markle, and it could be any kind. It could be race, gender, looks, American status, all of the above, something else altogether, but there's something there that makes them unable to humanize her, unable to see her as a fellow person, unable to treat her decently, unable to want that for her. Like, there isn't even that kind of thing of well, I want her to be better. For a few of them perhaps, but for most it's like, I just want her to suffer, is their mindset. They want her to like experience the worst fate. Um yeah, it's sad. So that kind of person interprets, willfully or dishonestly all of her movements. Like, she can just do no right. She is impossibly bad and even evil. And that's another thing that's part of misogyny, is how easy it is for a woman to be labeled the most extreme type of bad, evil. Like, again, Putin exists, he has to do something, and men generally have to do something, well, truly evil, like murderous, something very cruel to be labeled evil. A woman need only to be suspected, to be accused, to just rub you the wrong way, and they're the same. And for many, worse. Meghan would be the worst one. She's at least the one who makes them angrier. She's the one who they really want to see suffer, who they really want to, see hurt, even more so than a Putin. It's an incredible thing in our world, the intensity of ire designated for women who quote unquote sin. And again, the sin itself is always so debatable with targeted women. So yeah, to them, Meghan Markle, she's just impossibly bad. Like, bad in a way that isn't even realistic for most humans. Just incapable of good. Everything she does, everything she says by this type of person will always be interpreted, reframed as negative. Truly, quite literally, she can do no right. Every action, even if it's an objectively positive one, will be reframed as negative. It is a type of derangement. To interpret a human that way so baselessly is genuinely a type of derangement. A functional one. You can get by in life being that level of deranged, but it is a type of genuine derangement. I don't even mean that as a pejorative. And Meghan Markle specifically has more than proven herself with her past reputation and life that she is just, she's an overwhelmingly decent person, but, that all gets discarded to create a new narrative, which is that she is malicious. You have to ignore that past. You have to ignore things like her humanitarianism, her personality and what it showed itself to be. It's unfortunate too that she doesn't even have her former blog where that really showed who she was, but she was asked to shut it down, as she was entering the royal family. And I even wonder if that was requested to sort of help erase, what she truly is, who she truly was. Because now it's a little bit easier, but not altogether easy, but it's a little easier to erase her past and to create a completely new past, a one that satisfies the agenda of framing her as a bad human to the core. So in all movements, in all gestures, in all behaviors, in all things she ever did, that's how they frame her. Nothing she ever did was for a good reason. It was all for this specific reason of attaining power just to attain it and nothing else. It's just not how most humans even are. This concept of woman that this type of person has. And this is a thing that women, and I know there's overlap here because there are black women, but women and people of color share, where it's the worst way to exist. There's that saying, the worst place you can exist, or the most dangerous place you can exist, is in a white man's head, I think is how that saying goes. But basically, I mean, what applies there is, or what applies here from that idea is that the imagination of what women are, these vicious women, that almost never is found to be real. You know, this witchy woman archetype is such a rarity. It's such a non thing in our world, but it's treated as a very common thing, a thing under every corner, a thing that is in, like, sometimes, like, if you go in like red pill spaces, it's like something every woman has, even though, again, look at history, look at facts, actual facts of how, I mean, the sexes have behaved. Overwhelmingly, one has been the following sex, like, they kind of just do what their tribe of men are doing, and, you know, go along for the ride. And the other has been very antagonistic. I'll leave it at that. But somehow, some way, that propaganda works, where people just have a very easy time imagining a woman just being this, like, Cruella de Vil, this cruel devil creature that is just, again, impossibly bad, impossibly evil, just has no humanity. And I do think it's a mixture of people genuinely believing that and genuinely being able to see women, and again, especially women of color, like that. But I also think it's, you know, like, at least half the time, people who just, they don't really care about how true that is. They don't care if Meghan is actually evil, and many don't even think she is. It's just, they are it's such a strong word, it's an extreme word, but they are fundamentally the evil person in that dynamic between Meghan and the hater. And the hater always feels so immature. But for lack of a better word, between Meghan and the hater is the evil person, the unreasonable person who just will not listen to facts. Again, I've engaged with that kind of person, and they are very resistant to facts that contradict the narrative that they have pushed and have either chosen to believe in, or just prefer to push to justify the contempt that they have for the person. Because again, you cannot just say, I just hate this person and I want to see them suffer. You have to create a reason that at least can be argued as reasonable. She's evil, that's why I hate her and want to see her suffer. Because if you don't have that, you just are exposed as the monster in that dynamic. I feel like monster is a slightly better word than evil. I don't know why. Yeah. So that's what we're dealing with.
You can tell me that this is just a coincidence. There's so many signals at the same time.
I mean, well, no. Your biased and likely dishonest interpretations are naturally not going to be coincidences. They're a product of your bias. So naturally, when you have a bias against someone and then you interpret their gestures, their every gesture, as negative, it's not a coincidence. It's a byproduct of your inability to look at them or anything they do favorably.
Let's put play just to see what happens next. You can see that he is visibly nervous, and
Well, I personally don't know if Harry was nervous in this moment. He could have been. That's definitely a possibility. He was about to give his speech before the UN here, so, you know, when you're about to give a speech, that's a reasonable time to be nervous, and perfectly understandable. Because, of course, Harry could be nervous, and of course, these could be little bursts of nervous energy, all the movements, the gestures, but they also could just be the gestures of someone waiting their turn and have no significant meaning beyond that. And if you'll notice, Body Language Guy is not entertaining anything like that. He's not entertaining the possibility of anything positive or neutral for the most part. where he is able to spin in a negative way, he will take that chance. That seems to be his pattern, at least with this video. That is also not a coincidence, that everything he happens to see in this couple that he doesn't like, who he has a prerogative to frame in a negative light, just happens to be negative. Never good. Funny that.
He is even venting, you know, that when you put your tongue in your cheek.
So I don't think that venting is quite the right word, but I do note that the tongue-in-cheek motion is often done out of nervousness, and it can also be done out of playfulness, and it's also just one of those tics that humans do sort of mindlessly when in an idle state, and it doesn't even have to be tied to nerves. But if it were, that would make sense. Again, he's about to give this speech at the UN. It even fits with why he would place his arm in his wife's hand if that's one of his small comforts when he's nervous, about to do something like public speaking. That fits. That is a reasonable and neutral way of interpreting Harry's movements that, of course, the body language guy does not entertain because of his intention to malign Meghan and paint negatively all of Harry's movements and behaviors.
He's doing that. It's like his attitude changed completely from here, he was on his own, to this.
So this was some particularly manipulative framing by the body language guy, because think about what we're actually seeing versus what body language guy is saying.
It's like his attitude changed completely from here.
Here being the couple having a pleasant but naturally temporary interaction with each other that elicited mutual smiles, but again is a naturally temporary moment, as again smiles after a pleasantry have a natural fading window. People don't just stay like that. You'll see it when Harry interacts with the gentleman on his left here. They share a pleasantry, they smile, and in the full video, eventually both of their smiles fade. That's human, that's natural, that's how interactions work. You naturally go back into your resting face. It's nothing to do with energy shifting or attitude changing. It's just the natural ebb and flow of human behavior.
He was on his own to this.
But see, this is the body language guy being ostensibly manipulative, because Harry was not on his own at any point. The very moment he's comparing this moment to is one where he was interacting happily with his wife. That's not being on your own. The difference is that his arm is rested in her lap, which, again, he put there. He moved his arm there in response to her touching his forearm, which is not an automatic reaction. It's not a necessity to move your arm into your partner's lap when they touch your forearm. And we see that with this same couple in this same time frame, where Meghan moves her arm to touch his forearm later, and he doesn't move his arm into her lap. They're just seated there with her arm lightly rested on his forearm, which again is the move that body language guy says, well, this is more normal, which you'll see again in a bit. So there isn't even like a Pavlovian thing you could argue here, where he's just trained to put his arm there when she touches him. No, he made a choice. When he puts his arm here as it is in this still, that was a choice. He moved his arm into her lap because it seems to offer him comfort. So it's just dishonest and clearly deliberately intended to malign Meghan for Body Language Guy to tell his audience that this is a negative attitude shift on Harry's part.
It's like his attitude changed completely from here, he was on his own, to this.
So I just wanted to play that bit from Body Language Guy in full again to make clear that the manipulation in his words is in the dishonesty of calling the natural subsiding of a smile and the natural shift into a more serious countenance befitting of the event, and that is one of many normal ways to carry oneself in such a setting, and is mirrored by most around him, a negative energy shift or a negative attitude shift, which he implies is the case, then outright even accuses Meghan in a misogynistic way of causing this negative mood shift in Harry because of her clinginess, because women be clingy, and this malevolent desire in Meghan, who apparently is meant to, from the Body Language Guy's framing and characterizing, is meant to be this evil lady archetype, wants Harry to be unhappy, and that manipulation necessitates framing Harry, who is pushing 40, as this mindless automaton of a victim, because he just represents man in this moment. He's this victimized man who is the victim of this witchy evil woman. And these archetypes they feel so natural to a lot of people. It's so easy to see a woman as witchy and evil because of centuries of propaganda, because of rampant cultural misogyny that is global, that vilifies women, that makes it so easy for people to buy women as the villain, and a particular type of villain that, again, does not align with reality. It doesn't align with who dominates in villainous behavior, and it doesn't truly mirror what women are actually like, how complex women actually are in real life. They are seldom just evil in this man-eater kind of way. Like evil racists, sure. Evil misogynists, yeah. Evil misogynistic women, yeah. And even those two types of evil women have their complexities and are, interestingly enough, never thrown into this category of the evil witchy woman. Like, being a racist doesn't get you thrown in there. Being a misogynist as a woman doesn't get you thrown in there. That's not the witchy thing that the masses vilify. It's your relationship with men. It's being too empowered. It's wanting any kind of control in your relationship, even control over yourself. Like, people even vilify Meghan for not wanting to walk out right after she had her baby, Archie, in front of a bunch of cameras, something Diana famously even said she hated, and that was so painful for her. So even a woman taking agency over herself, which she should have full right to do, especially in such a vulnerable state, this inspires a rage, an ire in people for her. This is, for them, an example of how she is this witchy woman. She doesn't just do what men say. She doesn't just comply. So it's very easy for certain people to paint Harry as the victim of this witchy woman, and to buy for this type of person that Meghan is a witchy woman, despite her history contradicting that. It's very easy for them to see and frame Harry as victimized by the wife, the ball and chain, even though he just elected to rest his arm in her lap, and even though he just shared that pleasantry with and looked genuinely happy to be exchanging that pleasantry with her. So it's like he's happy when he talks to her, but not happy when she touches him, and he's unhappy when she touches him, yet he initiates touching her multiple times when they're seated here. His behavior, when assessed honestly, contradicts completely the victim narrative that body language guy and other guys with this misogynistic bias are trying to push. So this concludes part 1, and a link to part 2 is available in the description. Please subscribe, share, and thumbs up if you liked this video, and also let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also, thank you so much for watching and listening. It's really important to push back against irrational, misogynistic, and racist hate, or at least to try. So goodbye for now, and see you in the next and final part. Again, thank you for your time.